Hello, everybody, and welcome to Voting Rights for Indigenous Populations, hosted by California Humanities as part of our initiative, California on the Ballot. I'm Julie Fry. I am President and CEO of California Humanities, and I'm delighted to be joined today by our guests, Christina Snyder and Jordan James Harvell. We're really glad that you can be with us this afternoon. I'll say a few words about this series and then give the floor to my colleague, Kirsten Vega, who's going to moderate. So if you're not familiar with us at California Humanities, we're an independent nonprofit organization. We partner with the National Endowment for the Humanities, and they have generously supported this program through their initiative, A More Perfect Union. But since 1975, we've produced, funded, supported humanities-based projects and programs across California, awarding over $38 million in grants across the state, and also delivering programs that reach every corner. In the California on the Ballot series, we reflect on the state of civic engagement in California. We examine the lesser known history of our electoral traditions and assess what changes might be in store. So today's program is the finale of season 2. Our theme is voting rights for Native communities in California. And the questions we're asking are what barriers stand in the way of full voter access and political voice for the Indigenous people in our state. And we're really pleased to have 2 leaders in this field here to discuss the work they're doing to address these vast disparities. So moderating today is Kirsten Vega, our Associate Program Officer and the manager of California on the Ballot series. Over to you, Kirsten.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Julie. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. As we start the program, we just wanted to take a moment to really acknowledge the complexity and diversity of California's Native peoples, who encompass together over 300 distinct cultural groups, language communities, and tribes in the state, each with distinct languages, histories, and relationships, not only to this place, but to its politics. As Christina shared with me earlier this week, California is today home to the largest population of Native people anywhere in the country. And California's territory was pre-contact the most populous place north of Mexico. So in this spirit, we want to acknowledge that all land is Native land, and the offices of California Humanities are located in Oakland on the homeland of the Ohlone people. So as we sort of delve into this topic of voting rights and civic engagements within Native communities, we just want to remember that all these groups have inherently different needs and different traditions of self-governance too, which should be acknowledged in any conversation about electoral engagement. So with that said, I want to introduce Christina and Jordan. Without further ado, Christina Snyder serves as Tribal Affairs Secretary to Governor Gavin Newsom. Christina leads the Governor's Office of Tribal Affairs, which was an office formally established only in July of this year. She is an enrolled member of the Dry Creek Rancheria Band of Pomo Indians. Joining her today is Jordan James Harvell with Advanced Native Political Leadership. Jordan is the National Program Director who works on addressing the unique barriers that exist for Indigenous people in U.S. politics. I think in particular, the need for greater representation in elected and appointed office at every level. Jordan is a member of the Cherokee and Choctaw Nations. So welcome, Christina and Jordan. We'd love to hear from you all during this session, so please do put your questions in the Q&A and we'll take them a little later in the hour. Okay, so just to start off, Christina, I wonder if I could turn to you to hear more about your journey into the secretary position and the creation of the Office of Tribal Affairs.
Sure. Thank you, Kirsten. And thank you, Julie, for inviting me to be able to speak with you all today. And hopefully I don't get too into the weeds and we can have kind of a high-level conversation about Native vote and access to the places where decision makers are making all the decisions. So again, my name is Christina Snyder. I'm a member of the Dry Creek Rancheria Band of Pomo Indians in Sonoma County, which is in itself its own sovereign government. And I am an attorney by trade and came to this office by way of National Congress of American Indians, where I also worked on some national voting advocacy, voting rights, and then also get out the Native vote, which is kind of the big push across the nation for tribal nations to be able to get to their constituents and get them to the ballot. My office was formally established in 2011 by Governor Jerry Brown, and it was the Office of the Tribal Advisor at the time, and was created because at the time, tribes finally had a little bit of the political inroads to be able to ask the governor to commit to creating a space for direct access and engagement for tribal nations. At the time, tribes had been gaining some political power just by way of being able to engage more economically and being able to think more about what they wanted in their communities and engaging with other local communities. But also felt like as the governor was implementing his policy priorities, as the legislature was moving forward, there was a big disparity in how tribes were being able to engage in the places, the systems, the natural resources that they've been a part of since time immemorial. And so when Governor Brown came in, it was his third term. His first term, he created the Native American Heritage Commission. So he had kind of a track record of being an ally of tribal nations. And in his third term, we had entered into what we call the self-determination era already, where tribes were seeking to better assert their inherent sovereignty and engage with other governments as co-equals. And so asked and got the commitment from the governor to create a cabinet level position as a tribal liaison and advisor to the governor. So that formally created this position, which then after years and years of kind of chipping away, finally turned into the Office of Tribal Affairs within the governor's office with a Secretary of Tribal Affairs, which is where I sit now. I think I will stop there. And if folks have questions, feel free to put them in the chat.
Thanks so much, Christina. Jordan, can we go to you now to talk about your journey into this work? I know you have a background in voter mobilization. You were chief of staff at Vote America. How did you get to this place?
Sure. Thank you so much, Kirsten. As was mentioned at the top, my name is Jordan James Harvell. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation and descendant of the Choctaw Nation. And I'm the National Program Director for Advanced Native Political Leadership. I will say that my journey into politics started really young. I first started working with Congressman Garamendi when I was just 14 years old, working on voter registration campaigns. And that was one of the very first moments that I realized the disparities in who was registered and who wasn't registered to vote, right? Most of the focus that I worked with was youth, but also in neighborhoods that no one wanted to canvass. And I couldn't figure out why, as a young person, why we only chose certain parts of the county to go after and other parts maybe not. And so that continued when I went to college. I went to San Francisco State University, which is the home to the first College of Ethnic Studies in the nation, and also kind of the seeding ground for what would later become the occupation of Alcatraz, which is really incredible. But when I got there, I continued to work on political campaigns throughout my time there and really got politicized from my Native identity, which was a hard thing to claim when you're a young kid in California, because it wasn't taught much, and the things that were taught were honestly not the most exciting things to talk about, right? And beyond that, it wasn't my history either. I'm Cherokee and Choctaw, and my tribes are from well, currently in Oklahoma and from Georgia. And so that is also not our history as well. So there was no real place to engage with that. Later on, after working on several political campaigns, I went to work for Vote America, and our work really focused on turning out what at that point we were calling the Rising American Electorate. Now we call the New American Majority, which is primarily communities of color, unmarried women and young people under the age of 35. And so we did a whole range of tactics to kind of turn folks out. And that led me in 2020, as I was doing this work, I'd always been interested in Native American political engagement and what it looked like, where along with young people, Natives as an electorate are of the lowest turnout in the nation compared to young people, which is not typically a group you want in company when we're talking about voter turnout, because it's quite a large disparity, right? And I wanted to figure out why exactly that was. And we started building relationships and in Indian country. And in 2020, Yazzie v. Hobbs came down the Arizona Supreme Court, which was a decision that essentially denied the right to extend the mail-in ballot deadline during a time when the USPS was slowing the Postal Service was slowing first-class mail delivery. And so at this point, the challenge essentially was that on the Navajo Nation, where the majority of Native voters in Arizona lived, there's about 400,000 Native voters in all of Arizona. Almost half of them live on the Navajo Nation and the surrounding areas. in order for first class mail to get to the center of the res and then to get back in time to be turned in, it would have required just about 3 weeks essentially to get there and get back. That was longer than the mail-in ballot deadline. So it structurally oppressed half of the Native population in Arizona. And there was this mad dash in October of 2020 to figure out, well, how do we make sure folks can actually have their voice heard? And we worked through mutual aid networks on the ground. There was a public health order in place at that point. And so no one could enter the reservation. And this was not just the Navajo Nation alone, but the Navajo Nation was the largest case of this. You couldn't enter the Navajo Nation at that point. And so much of the money went to seeding a lot of organizers on the ground who were doing that long-term work. To try to get their neighbors to the polls. It was wildly successful. The 3 counties that span the Navajo Nation, the voter turnout was 130% of 2016 on average, which is a massive turnout boost for folks in the space. And what it showed was that any substantial and sustained investment in Indian country yields massive results. And so you're going to hear me come back to this concept a lot over the time that we talk today. But that directly kind of led to my work here at Advance. And so I took the job just shortly after 2020, and we built the Native Leadership Institute. And I'll quickly talk about Advance's history, and then I'll kind of wrap up. Advance was founded in 2016 by a group of 4 co-founders, Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan of Minnesota. She's White Earth. Chrissy Castro, who is Dene in Chicana, and she's the Executive Director of California Native Vote here in California, which is incredible. Kevin Killer, who's the president of the Wall Lakota Nation, and Anathea Chino, who also serves as our Executive Director. She's Akmo Pueblo, and spent many of her years in philanthropy. And these folks really represented this diversity of Indian country and came together under this idea that there were these 520,000 offices nationally, 519,000 and change nationally, from city council to dog catcher, or city council to president. And Natives, in order to reach representational parity, needed about 17,000 of those seats after the 2020 census. That's basic representational parity. We have less than 200 Native elected officials nationally, and so that gap of 200 to 17,000 required a massive intervention to get to. And out of that created the Native Leadership Institute, which is a training program that recruits and trains Native leaders to run for office. So we designed that. In addition to that, that's one of our core pillars. The other 2 are weaving state and national Native-led organizations, C3 and C4 organizations, around getting out the vote and building that political infrastructure in Indian country. And then the third pillar is researching data. And I'll talk a little bit about data and visibility later in the conversation as well. But it's also a huge gap in our community, and it's a result of kind of the decades of underinvestment in what it looks like to have higher political participation. And so that's what brought me to this work.
Wow, less than 200 electeds. That's a staggering number. Well, thank you, Jordan. You mentioned that, being Cherokee and Choctaw, that you have a homeland that's outside of California. Christina, you mentioned to me earlier this week that California has the highest density of Native people who are from a non-California territory. Your office serves the whole state of California. Could you talk to us a little bit about who is in California? What is the architecture of Native life and Native communities in California today?
Sure. And so I'll start too by kind of going through a little bit of terminology so that we're not confusing people, because we may use interchangeably Indian country, or American Indian, Native American, and then sometimes Indigenous. And so when we talk about Indian or American Indian or Indian country, those are typically federal terms that are used within federal statutes. And so that's why we use them in that context. Native and Native American are typically used within state statute and are typically how California Native people refer to themselves in kind of common conversation. But you'll hear me kind of use them interchangeably. And then Indigenous is typically used in the context of international affairs and typically denotes people who are Indigenous to a place. So if I say I'm Indigenous, that's literally everybody in the world is Indigenous to somewhere. But if I'm Indigenous to California or to the lands of Sonoma County or that type of thing, I'm providing some specificity. So just so you go out into the world, you understand kind of the different terminology. And in California, we have all of it. So we have the largest number of Native people generally, and the two largest populations are Cherokee and Navajo. I don't think it's in that order, but those are the two largest populations of Native people in California. We have the second largest number of federally recognized tribes at 109. We also have about 63 non-federally recognized tribes who are on the list of the Native American Heritage Commission for purposes of cultural resource and sacred sites protection. So meaning they are tribes that are heritage tribes that are from here, but that the federal government doesn't recognize as tribes, but are still, for all intents and purposes, groups of Native people who are indigenous to California. We've also got a very large population of Native people who have been relocated through federal policies or through just general kind of seeking out a different place to live and to thrive in California. So very large urban populations that tend to be a mix of California Native people and non-California Native people. So that's who we're talking about and kind of what we think about when we think about all of the policy work here in California. We're also including, but not for the purposes of this conversation, this office also looks at Indigenous peoples of the Americas generally, and of places like New Zealand, Australia, because of the similar kind of backgrounds and disparities there. And the opportunities for us to be able to work together to kind of elevate common goals and common interests. So that is who we're talking about. And when we're talking about Native vote, we're thinking about it with different lenses. So we think about both access of California Native communities who are living on tribal lands, which is typically in rural areas with lack of infrastructure, fewer offices to be able to go vote in person, fewer services like the USPS. And then we're also talking about urban populations that are pretty dense of California Native people and Native people generally. And where are they going? Are they feeling welcome in these places? And are kind of those general kind of access to the polls issues that you might think about when you think about urban populations. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much for the lexicon, for the orientation, and for all that information, which I think sets up the rest of the conversation really, really well. So Jordan, I'm thinking about the story you shared about the completely infeasible mail-in vote timeline. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the barriers historically and in the present moment that Native communities have faced in California.
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest kind of challenges, or historically when you look at it, I don't think many problems have been resolved. Let me start there. So in 1924, we have the Snyder Act that's passed that is the Indian Citizenship Act. It's the moment in time in which Native folks get the right to vote technically, right, because they become citizens. This isn't really fulfilled in almost any state in 1924 because the systemic barriers to then voting are placed up, and many, many laws around voter suppression are passed following the next 50 years to prevent full turnout for full registration or anything like that. In fact, I'm going to talk about this in a second, but in 1930, California actually reinstated voter registration. There was a period of about 80 years where California didn't have voter registration at all because it saw it as an impediment to voting. But when Native folks got the right to vote, they actually reintroduced voter registration, and it's been here ever since, in order to create a barrier and a challenge for low-income folks, for communities of color to access voter registration, because that means that they had to go to a county clerk, they had to pass literacy tests, they had to go through the whole set of rings to kind of get there. And so there's this term that's often used, I think, when we think about Native voters, which is apathy. And it's the one that I have a huge challenge with. And it's because when we talk about apathetic voters, I often say that it's not that people don't want to vote, it's that they can't vote. Right. And for the vast majority of folks, they really fall in this bucket of those that don't vote. They fall in this bucket of either being disaffected or disenfranchised. Right. And so we should talk about being disenfranchised, but I think being disaffected is often what people are thinking of when they think of apathy. Right. But disaffection is a little bit different. What disaffection means is that the system isn't working out as it should. Right. That the process itself people no longer have faith in. Apathy is not caring what the result is going to be. And our communities deeply care about the decisions that are made about us, but they've oftentimes been challenged with how that system creates the results that it does and whether they can affect that change or not. And so that's one of the core issues that we have to face as folks are coming in and leaders are coming in and thinking about the Native vote as they decide to run for office. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of those barriers. In voter registration, we often say that voter registration is voter suppression. It's an extra barrier that doesn't need to be there. And thankfully, California in the last few years is making really substantial strides to reduce the barriers around voter registration, passing online voter registration, introducing automatic voter registration for large portions of the population. And that's really incredible. And that's a work that's happened in just the last few years to really engage larger amounts of community. But voter turnout is kind of another piece of that pie. And so you heard me talk earlier about sustained investments. And one of the things that we often think about on the research arm of the Native Leadership Institute are these billions and billions of dollars that have always historically went into presidential elections. It increases every year. But really since the 1950s, we've seen massive sets of investment going into politics, and it has driven who votes and who doesn't vote, right? And so one of the myths I think around voter turnout is that somehow certain populations are just predisposed to voting higher than other ones. What the thing I would like to address about that is that really what's happened is that if you look at different communities over time, particularly in California as one of the largest political spenders in the nation, that those monies fall into categories of people that they believe will be most likely to vote. Politicians often will chase certain voters and spend more money on them over time and cause reinforcing cycles of voting. And so white populations were the original because they were the most able to vote over time, white males particularly. And as the Democratic right kind of expanded, money started to trickle into other groups, but really didn't until the 2000s. And so one of the things that we talk a lot about is the voter file, which is this tool that we use in politics on every part of politics and all sides of the aisle. And basically it's a conglomeration of voter registration records that happens, and they overlay more information on top of it, right? To kind of learn about how someone might interact with the political system. And out of the voter registration kind of data that we create on almost every voter in the United States, candidates get access to this, and they use these things called models, right? And these have been in politics for essentially the last 20 years and have started to really define kind of our political system. The models project who is most likely to vote and who is not most likely to vote. And prior to this, we used demographic kind of stereotypes to determine this, right? White voters might vote more than brown voters. Latinx voters might vote a little bit higher. Black voters might vote a little bit higher than Native voters, right? And using these kind of benchmarks to determine who turns out and who doesn't. The challenge is that once you leverage these kind of models, what happens is that money then rushes over 75% to the folks who are the most likely to vote. And so they'll be pushed to the polls and they'll say, hey, vote, vote, vote. You'll see it everywhere on billboards. Now modern day on your cell phone, you would get direct mail to your house, right? People would come knocking on your doors. But what we found over time is that those folks, because voting is a habit, will then vote more and more often and then receive higher and higher likelihoods of voting. And if less money is going to folks who are not seen as high voters, then they'll continue down that cycle as well. And so it creates this self-fulfilling prophecy as the way that we run our elections, all candidates and all parties. And so what this has led to, we just did a study with the cooperative election. We did an analysis of the cooperative election study, which is a national survey. And it basically takes a ton of data from all of the states and all of the polls that are happening and brings it together. And this is in Harvard. And what we did was we looked at 2012 to 2020, and we asked a ton of questions about Native political participation and tried to see what we could pick up. Native folks tend to not be in these studies as subgroups, so they're actually challenging to pull any findings out of it. But we were able to get small sample sizes and enough to draw some conclusions off of. One of the things that we found was that from 2012 to 2015, or 2020, my apologies, that 50% of Native voters reported not being contacted by a political campaign at all from either side. 50%. And if you remember 2012 or 2016 or 2020, I think the most people probably listening to this couldn't get away from political campaigns, right? They were inundated by messages from political campaigns. But if 50% of Native voters don't even get contacted by a campaign, then they actually live in an information environment that's completely different than folks outside of the Native community. They might not know which candidates to support. They might not know the process of voting. Political campaigns actually are like one of the largest drivers of kind of information for the average voter on how do you access vote by mail? How do you when does the early voting deadline start? When is the voter registration deadline? And if you're not getting any of those messages, then the result is going to be that in the course of your daily life, with all of the other socioeconomic factors that we can imagine, you're going to either forget, you are perhaps not going to turn in your ballot. You might have a last minute challenge to the polls that's not addressed through funding like busing programs and things like that we have in politics. And you might not be sure who's actually speaking to you, right? And whether they're speaking to you on something that might change your current situation. So what I will say is that as we kind of think about Native communities, I think back to kind of the 1950s and think about the period of termination, right? And understand kind of the warfare that Native communities felt under at that time. And understanding that there's been no investment in saying, this is how we solve these problems. This is how we move the community forward. All of those issues and those conversations have had to happen within the community through tribal governments, typically, to defend ourselves, rather than trying to figure out how do we leverage, this right of citizenship to run for office and to make these decisions ourselves. So the number one thing I can point to in kind of the history, if we're thinking about the Native vote, is investment. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. I've been talking long enough.
Oh, thanks, Jordan. You're surfacing some really, really fraught voter access issues. Christina, I wonder if you have anything to add to that.
I think I'll just add that I think part of the challenge here in California is the history of erasure of California Native people. And so I think in a problem of outreach and access to Native communities, you have to even know that they're there. And so if we have kind of a common culture and a dominant culture that doesn't quite understand what Native communities are, what their needs are, what the value is in accessing Native communities, then we have some bigger problems. And so it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, but I think part of it starts with, at the inception of statehood, the laws that were passed by the legislature that basically denied Native people the right to speak, the right to access the courts, the right to kind of do anything, basically legalized indentured servitude and legal slavery, but also kind of stole the voice of Native people to be able to do anything about it. And so I think all of those early actions in statehood created this, and something that was built upon, created this narrative that Native people aren't here, that they never were here, and that there was this sort of manifest destiny that was being fulfilled at the time that California joined the Union. And so when you start with kind of a full-scale erasure of one of the largest populations, north of Mexico, and you build on that by then depriving Native people of place, depriving Native people of access to resources, depriving Native people of access to the structures that would allow them to have that voice, then I think you also then create a culture that doesn't even see Native people at all, except, they'll see a casino, or maybe they'll see some sort of, they'll see something in Hollywood. And I think that that's kind of the bigger issue here that we're trying to address as well, is that that people have to know we're here and know that we have those needs in order for them to be able to reach out to us and understand that is a need. And I think about it in the context of, the two governors that have really done a lot of work in this space, which is Governor Brown and Governor Newsom. Both of those, the inroads that they've made were because they had personal relationships with Native people in the community. So Governor Brown had personal relationships dating back to, the 60s. And then Governor Newsom, in his time in San Francisco, was very close with some of the founders of Friendship House, just had like a lot of engagement and was able to have that understanding of the needs of urban Native communities, and then be able to be introduced to the needs of tribal nations as well. And so I think that Jordan is like very spot on in addressing the fact that we don't have the kind of investment that other communities have. But I think it's also like people don't even know that we exist, and so how do they know to invest in our communities? And I think the payoff, as he said as well, is just can be amazing. You see in Alaska, you have write-in ballots. You have write-in folks that made it to the Senate on write-in ballots. And so that was all through Native communities and Native vote. And even here, you see that a lot of the Native voices that are making it to the table are because Native communities are pushing them there once they have that investment and that attention.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Christina and Jordan. I feel like this architecture of voter access and inequity is such a large topic. And so far we've talked about voter access in terms of voting at the state or federal or maybe even local levels, but you've both shared with me that in your experience, there's voting and governance that happens within tribal nations and within Native communities. I would love to hear each of you speak a little bit about that type of engagement. Could we start with you, Jordan?
Absolutely. I think because of kind of the histories that Christina just talked about and some of the things that we talked about earlier, there has been a massive trust deficit in Indian country in general, in our tribal nations, where if you look at kind of trust in government scores in general, Native communities fall on the lowest level of any community in the United States, in every state. And so what that looks like for us is that, if less than half of Natives believe that by going to government in general, that it can solve our challenges, then where do we turn? And I think the answer has always been our tribal nations, right? Our tribal leaders are some of the most trusted. It's where we get a lot of our news. To this day, for like my grandparents, they still sit around and wait for our quarterly newsletter to come from the Cherokee Nation, and they read it off to anyone who's sitting around to listen. They listen really intently to our tribal newspapers and radio stations that are tribally owned. And so I think that for us, what it has looked like is essentially, you have this localized community, you have folks that oftentimes that you've elected to tribal government, and you can call if you need anything. And these become our access points to need, and kind of has been the facilitators of that for the last several generations. So that's a little bit, I think, of my experience with it. It's true that our tribal nations play this really pivotal role. I will also say, though, that not all of the kind of heft in our community is placed on our tribal governments. It also lives in our communities. And I think that there is an underappreciation for how many decisions and how much mobilization happens in our groups of aunties. And in our grandmas, pulling together fry bread sales, or pulling together a car wash when someone graduates, or when someone needs a funeral, or anything like that. That a lot of the decisions in our communities actually happen at that kind of level, and those folks serve as community leaders. And so that's even in communities like mine, where I grew up in kind of the rural, like outside of Bakersfield, which is where a large Cherokee and Choctaw population is. But we didn't have necessarily all of the cultural gatherings that you would if you lived in Oklahoma. But even then, our communities kind of came together around these key moments to support each other. And that's how we interacted civically with each other. And so that was my experience anyway.
And I'll jump in. just to walk it back, because I'm not sure that folks who are listening understand tribal governance. So basically, every one of the tribes in California has its own way of electing officials. So some tribes have 2-year cycles, some have 4-year cycles, some have term limits, some don't, and it's all according to their own tribal traditions and laws. And so most tribal citizens in California and nationwide are accustomed to the cycles of tribal elections, and so are pretty active in those spaces. And some tribes, the only way that anything can get done is by a majority vote of their membership. So for example, if we're trying to enter into an agreement to open up a wine tasting room, all of that sometimes needs to go through our tribes, because some tribes are general council tribes, which means every single member of the tribe is an actual council member for purposes of larger contracts and bigger decisions of the tribe. Other tribes have delegated authority, which looks a little bit more like a representative democracy, where we have elected officials that kind of do everything on behalf of the tribe, and those bigger decisions get delegated to them as well. So tribes have a very, very long history of kind of engaging in these political processes and democratic processes. And the Constitution itself is kind of based on an Iroquois confederacy that is the earliest democracy that people know of. And so just even the concept of voter engagement, democratic process is a very, very old process for Indian country. In California specifically, it has also been kind of a way of bridging into local government, because what happens is tribal governments will get really kind of concerned about the issues and the problems that are happening with the local government and their inability to be able to make inroads there, because sometimes there's just kind of talking past each other and not quite understanding common issues and common solutions. And so what happens, and what's happened in the cases of people like Supervisor Crandall in Lake County, who's former chairman of Robinson Rancheria, Supervisor Moke Simon, who's current chairman of Middletown Rancheria, and then Assemblymember Ramos, who's former chairman of San Manuel Band and Mission Indians. All of them were at points in their careers as tribal chairs where they hit kind of a point of, these folks aren't getting what we're trying to communicate. We need to get in there and kind of translate what we're doing and translate it into Indigenous informed governance versus trying to make inroads in a place that isn't going to think the way that we think. So I think, I guess bottom line is long history of engaging with those processes, but also, again, lots of demands on Native people from their own governments, and where there's kind of bigger issues that need to be addressed within the community, then Native folks kind of more quickly, catalyze those movements. And you saw, I think, in recent elections, record numbers of Native folks going to the polls and running for office as well, to kind of address some of the issues we've seen with other governments not quite serving our interests.
Yeah, Jordan, I'm so glad you mentioned kind of engagement with the news cycle, your family, reading Cherokee Nation newspapers very intentionally and engaging in their community and in their civic space through bake sales and car washes. Because I think one thing we've really learned in California on the ballot is that civic engagement goes well beyond the ballot box, right? There's also serving on jury duties. In some cases, we've talked to immigrants who have not obtained citizen status, but have continued on as key advisory roles and campaigns. There are so many other sites of decision making and engagement with civic life. So I was wondering, Christina, if you could talk a little bit about some of the movements that have come out of California, like the American Indian movement and other examples of civic engagement that go beyond voting.
Sure. So California has historically been kind of a seed for a lot of national movements. The Native American Rights Fund actually came out of California Indian Legal Services. Same thing, Jordan mentioned the occupation of Alcatraz. And a lot of what has happened in California is that because we have displaced Native populations in California, who a lot were displaced to urban areas because of kind of the issues of this is a whole other story for another time, but how rancherias and reservations got established in California or didn't get established, displaced to urban areas, but then also these, like I mentioned, mass relocations of non-California Native people to urban areas for things like war efforts, for just jobs, for federal programs that were incentivizing moving people off reservations so that the federal government didn't have to adhere to its trust responsibilities anymore. But we now then had these large populations of urban Native folks who were just seeking community, and similar to what Jordan mentioned, is creating that community in these places that potentially didn't have the type of Native footprint that people were accustomed to. So people gathered in places and just started talking to each other and would have, meals together and have cultural practices together, create powwows together. And while all of this was happening, folks were noticing what we've been talking about today, that there's a lack of awareness, a lack of education, and a lack of service to Native people generally. And so when you get a lot of people together and things start getting hard, people start thinking about, what can we do about this? And so that's kind of what happened with Alcatraz, for example, is it was right at the time when so many communities were speaking up about their rights. So many communities were saying, hey, the federal government and this society generally is not serving us. Native people occupied Alcatraz more in an effort to kind of have greater education opportunities for their kids, but also just kind of as a statement against a government that wasn't serving Native interests and was basically seeking to kind of terminate that responsibility in a broad-based way. So Alcatraz was one. There was also tribes from throughout the state. Like I mentioned, land was a big thing, and people took a lot of land and didn't really pay for it, and also it was a whole thing. But Native people marched to Washington, D.C. to demand some sort of restitution for that, and catalyzed what ended up being the California Indian lands claim settlements, which we're still kind of re-examining now. But throughout history, we've had these massive kind of movements out of California because of that large urban population of folks who were just, fed up with what's happening. And then also California Native people who have been really bereft of a lot of what their birthrights should be. So I don't know if I covered everything, but I'll hand it off and maybe we can fill in the gaps.
Thanks so much, Christina. Jordan, something Christina said reminded me of a phrase you used in our prep meeting, which is that running for office might be seen as a service to bigger policy goals. So I was wondering if you could talk about the work you've been involved in preparing people to run for office for the first time and trying to train and recruit and fill elected official positions with Native people.
Yeah, thank you, Kirsten. I think so we have the Native Leadership Institute. Basically, we recruit folks, we talk to them about what the potential would be when they're running for office. Many folks come to us not knowing what office they might want to run for. They just know that they've been involved in their community for a long time. And they're frustrated at maybe some key issues. And they want to figure out how they can change that. And what we're finding in the research and in our classes anecdotally is that more often than not, Native folks aren't stepping up to run for office. And we talked about this, Kirsten, about ego, right? A lot of folks do run for office based on ego. And we know that from the political science literature. It's I feel like I have the answer, and let me step to the front of the line and be the person with the voice and take the mic. And actually, our communities are not monoliths in any degree, but in general, I would say that if you had to have a pan-Indigenous culture, it wouldn't be one in which you're stepping to the front of the line and taking the mic and saying, I have all the answers. That's typically looked at as a no-no in most spaces. And so I think there's this kind of general hurdle that folks have to get over when it's time to run for office, right? Of why am I doing this in the first place, right? It feels almost counterintuitive to the way in which we make decisions in our communities. And more often than not, it's when you tie policy and the things that need to change in our world to the office in which it can, is when that kind of idea gets unlocked. And so one of the big things in kind of the journey of getting folks to run for office is talking to our community about, you know, a water crisis that's happening, or getting land back in a specific area, or seeing Native education being reflected in schools. These types of things, and tying them to school boards, right, or water commissions, environmental commissions, and these types of things. And so that's kind of the first step on that journey. Once they come into the program, there's two major things that we have in front of us. One is the mechanics of running for office, kind of seeing the path all the way through, understanding how modern campaigns are built and the kind of science behind campaigning. And that piece is important, definitely, to build the confidence internally. But the maybe harder thing to tackle, and the one that we didn't fully anticipate when we started this project, was that for many of our communities, we have never seen ourselves in office prior to folks like Secretary Holland, or any of the other Congress members who have been, you know, elected to office in the last several years. And because of that, the hurdle that we have is that there's an internalization of the fact of who is and who isn't worthy to hold office, and who is and who does and who doesn't have kind of a voice worth giving and a story worth telling. And so really kind of the center of our work is breaking down that concept of worthiness, who can speak, and what expertise is. I think one of the things we often talk about in our training is that your lived experience is your expertise. And the reason is because for so many of our communities, they have experiences and histories that have never really been told on a statewide stage or a national stage before. These are stories and histories of very specific communities and how they came to be, and the locations of their individual lands that have never been brought forward. And once they start talking about some of these pieces, what you quickly realize is the connection between all of the other issues that we might be facing in the broader community outside of the Native community, and they become genuine spokespeople. And so I'll mention maybe some statistics from here in California. My apologies. Is we're working with the California Native Vote Project now to kind of launch and to also adapt this program very specifically for California, because California is the home to the largest number of Native folks in the nation. It's one of our focus states, and there's about 19,000 elected officials in California up and down the ballot. 849 would be the number for us to reach parity in California. And by our record, and this is actually a really challenging thing to get, particularly at the municipal level, but we only have about 3, maybe 5, right, Native elected officials in all of California, which is a massive gap, less than 1% of where we need to be. And so the kind of the journey from here is, as California Native Vote is in their communities and organizing their communities around all sorts of issues that are impacting California tribes. What's emerging from them is not just a set of issues that they want to be seen at the forefront that folks like Assemblymember Ramos have been able to bring forward just in these last few years, but also there's community leaders that I think are emerging that are ready to run for office and want to figure out how. So that's the next step for us.
Wow, thanks, Jordan. It's so shocking to hear those numbers and to really comprehend the parity that would need to be reached just in the state of California. Okay, it looks like we are starting to approach 5 o'clock, and I'm realizing that an hour is probably too brief a time to get through the ambitious list of questions that we all wrote together for this program. But that said, we still want to open the floor up to questions from the audience. So please do write to us in the Q&A if there's something you'd like to ask Jordan or Christina. In the meantime, I want to move along a little bit to a federal topic briefly. So this spring, the Biden-Harris administration released a report on Native American voting rights. Their goal is really to highlight some of the structural barriers and participation gaps that are found nationally. And I was just curious, what does this report, mean to you, signify to you, coming from a presidential office? If we could start with you, Christina.
Well, I think as a baseline, anytime something's coming out of a government office that has a trust and treaty responsibility, that's a good thing. We have in California state government a truth and healing process that is both the state and the tribes together, putting together a report of reparative recommendations that would probably have some funding commitments to. And I think that anytime you've got the government who owes you things, telling you the things that they should do, you've got some pretty good support there. I think also it's really a wonderful way of framing what the issues are from the federal government's perspective. Again, who is supposed to be, like, a lot of these recommendations are that we need more federal funding for certain task forces and things like that. And we need to be able to have more postal service locations and better postal service access. And so I think just as a baseline, having that kind of common understanding of what the baseline issues are and what the collective truth is coming from the federal government in a way that looks like it's a Native advocacy document is a really wonderful thing in terms of getting more access, more funding, and more attention to these issues.
I also want to mention that our partner, the National Endowment of the Humanities, this year has appointed its first Native chairwoman, Shelley Lowe, who's from the Navajo Nation. So we're very thrilled to have her work as a leader at the NEH starting this year. Jordan, same question to you. What are your thoughts on the report?
Yes to everything Christina said. I think beyond that, I will just name that it puts a stake in the ground around the Voting Rights Act. For folks, might be familiar with the erosion of the Voting Rights Act over the last few years, 2013 in Shelby v. Boulder, and in 2020 in Bronovich v. DNC. Section 2 and Section 5, which are kind of the teeth of the Voting Rights Act, have been eroded pretty significantly, or set up to continue to be eroded. And I think what's critical is that we're passing things that reinforce it, because it gives us the opportunity of sliding backwards, right? Particularly with Native turnout and registration. And it endorses the Native American Voting Rights Act, which is an expansion of the first, includes 17 provisions from a number of national Native organizations. So this was a document crafted by Natives, and 17 provisions that would drastically change voter turnout outcomes in our community. So I'm happy that the administration is recognizing the importance of these types of documents.
I'll just jump in on that and say that, even the fact that this document looks the way it does is because we have a significantly greater representation in this current administration, and is why we're doing this. We're seeing something that looks like it's Native driven from the federal administration, which is amazing.
Yeah, so jumping off from this topic of recent changes to come, could each of you talk a little bit about some legislation or policy that's been proposed or passed in the last few years, specifically in California, that you think is of special interest or special significance in some way to the Native communities here? Jordan, we'll go to you first.
I'm going to name one quickly, and then I will pass off to Christina because I know this is her daily. So the California Indian Education Act is, I think, one of the most exciting new acts that have come down. And the primary reason, there's many, but the main reason why I'll say is that one of the largest problems that Native folks have nationally in almost every situation is invisibility. And so starting a conversation in our classrooms from a really young, early age about our histories and where the Indigenous lands that folks are growing up on is an incredible feat. And I'm super excited to kind of see what comes of it.
And I would say both. On the policy side, Executive Order B 1011 under Brown that created this office and created the charge for government-to-government consultation with tribes in California. And then the complementary N 1519 under Governor Newsom, which both reinforced that charge, but then also apologized for the genocide of California Native people at the state's inception, and then created a Truth and Healing Council to create more policy recommendations that the state would basically be beholden to, have both been incredibly influential in how the administration does our work. And then on the legislative side, there have been a number of changes, both in CalNAGPRA, so repatriation of human remains and cultural items, but then also recently, we just had a feather alert passed that is basically the Amber Alert for Native peoples. It's one of the first in the nation on the heels of Washington. We've also got, in addition to the California Indian Education We've got name changes to places like UC Hastings. We've got name changes with SQ words throughout the state. We've got now a government to government consultation act, which actually doesn't exist anywhere else. And so there's a lot of movement that's been happening and has been happening because we have this nice alignment and this nice, we have space for inclusion of Native voices and a real respect for the Native perspective as well.
So thinking about the implementation of some of these policies, these cultural shifts, I noticed that you're both members of kind of the millennial generation. You are both at this point, years into your career, and yet still part of a young movement, group of young leaders. I wonder if you could each talk a little bit about generational changes you're seeing as things shift into the next decade. Maybe Jordan, if you could start.
Yeah. I think that it is a really incredible time to be a Native person. I think as like a young person, when I was growing up, my family talked a lot about our histories, but didn't talk a lot about politics. And there's really specific reasons for that. Our family came over during relocation. And so the connection to our homeland was not severed, but it was definitely damaged quite a lot. And so not being able to go to many of your cultural gatherings, not being able to connect with your community in the same way meant that it was getting to watch, my grandparents speak Filagi, which are one of the few speakers left. And them talk about kind of them growing up on in Tahlequah, which is our homeland, was incredibly important, and we clung to those moments. I think for me, as like I've grown up, what I recognize is that I had incredible opportunities that they never were able to access. And in those opportunities, both through things like the internet, right, which was just changes over time, but also in like being able to go to college and being able to access jobs in which I could work for our community. Those were things that were just not possible prior. And so I think what was really beautiful about our generation is that there's this reclamation of our past and an access that we had never had. Prior generations didn't have when removal started, when things like, the Relocation Act started or termination started. There wasn't always that connection and being able to just easily access your cultural histories like we have today. And so I think it started a whole new kind of explosion of what reconnection looks like for many of us, particularly who were removed from kind of our homelands. So yeah, that'll be my piece.
And I'll say that I think that from our parents and our grandparents' generations, we also see, with the exception of some of the bigger movements, we see kind of a lot of hiding and a lot of being a bit more, or at least from my family, less outspoken about our Native heritage with the bigger population, because historically, if you were speaking your language, if you were saying that you were a Native person, you were potentially putting a target on your back and on your community's back. In Native boarding schools, kids that would speak their languages would get beaten a lot of times, have corporal punishment. And so there was a lot of incentive to not do those things and to not kind of explore your culture and to not, have that kind of advocacy or movement for your people. I think with our generation, we have, as Jordan mentioned, these greater opportunities to access education in a way that isn't kind of whitewashing our histories and is allowing us to really explore our heritage, have some pride in it, and revitalize it in a way that I think is safe now, but I can't kind of guarantee. But, we have so many now Native lawyers that we didn't have in generations before. We have mentors because people, went out there and blazed trails and now are helping bring more Native people into these spaces where we can make bigger changes. And we're even in a place where now, the UCs are all offering free tuition for all members of tribes throughout the United States. And so we have even greater access to these places where people learn the language of the dominant culture in order to kind of shift it in a way that feels more Indigenous to the extent that that's possible. So next generation, I think they're going to take this for granted, and that's a good thing. I can't wait to see what they're going to do next.
Yes. Well, before we close, I just want to ask if there's anything either of you wants to say that you haven't had a chance to say yet.
I just want to thank you all for bearing with my chaotic mind at the end of the day on a Wednesday, and really appreciate the time and energy that everybody has put into this work.
Oh, thanks so
I'll
much.
echo that. And I'll also say that please support Christina's work and all the things that she does, and California Native Vote's work. They're both doing incredible things to support and push forward the community here in California. And we need more of it. So.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Jordan. And we'll be sending out a note to everyone who attended or registered or is in the network for this program. And we'll make sure to include links to Christina's office and California Native Vote. They do great work in the state. Well, this being the last program currently scheduled in the California on the Ballot series, I have a rather long laundry list of thank yous, if you'll all bear with me. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much, Christina and Jordan. The depth and breadth of your expertise on these issues is extraordinary, and we're so grateful to you for educating us and illuminating these really complicated questions in such a knowledgeable and warm way. I also want to say thank you to my colleagues on staff at California Humanities, particularly Julie Fry, our president and CEO, who has just been a champion and key organizer of this series, as well as Beth Segura, who's been behind the scenes doing all of the tech work that takes our eyeballs into their most tired state, manning the Zoom and organizing a lot of things, as well as to our whole program staff who helped develop the concepts and partnerships that fueled this series. And again, to our funders, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and also the Mellon Foundation, which supported the first run of this program. So we'll say goodnight here, but thank you so much again for your time, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Take care.